Welcome to episode 6 of Data U, a Laker-led dive into student surveillance. Over the past episodes, we've examined how student data is collected, who controls it, how it's protected, and at times, how it's monetized. In this final episode, we step back and reflect, not just on what we've learned, but on what it all means. So, let's get started. So everybody, as you researched your topics, what surprised you the most about how student data is collected, used, or even monetized? And was there a moment when you realized something about the system that changed your perspective?
Hi, Joe. This is Faye. Definitely for me, I learned a lot from interviewing our participants on our episode. And something that I really found interesting, especially, and I mentioned this a bit on our episode as well, is that, we've heard of concepts like the school to prison pipeline, but listening to Mr. Clarence Oko, who we interviewed, actually really helped me with really conceptualizing how it's possible to actually do what is happening with the school to prison pipeline, where this really intense surveillance of students allows the local police departments, to actually over-police students and eventually lead for them to be considered higher risk within their areas and potentially even end up in prisons just straight from their schools, just based on their grades, based on their family backgrounds. And this is especially affecting marginalized students. So it's not even necessarily that my perspective was changed, but that it gave me such a new view and understanding how it works from the back end that I didn't have before.
Sure. No, those are very good points, Faye. And I know that when Tyler and I interviewed Dr. Roderick Crooks from the University of California, Irvine, he talked a lot about how data has impacted the Black and Latinx communities in K through 12 schools in the Los Angeles area. And there was a lot that kind of was surprising there. And to your point, in a lot of cases, what he found was that instead of creating opportunity, it was often used to benefit a lot of tech companies and privileged groups, turning these marginalized communities into sources of profit. So it is very sad to see that in a lot of cases that these groups were negatively affected. The other thing that was interesting for us when we looked a little bit into terms of service, particularly for a couple of the platforms that a lot of college students use, or just people in general across the industry. But I'll go on a positive note. It was interesting to see that there are a lot of things that we can do, which we discussed kind of at the end of our episode, that kind of talks about the protections that you can put in place, like auditing your settings, and especially when it comes to AI and other tools that can kind of help you a little bit with protection. So I thought that was interesting on our end. But what else did everyone find surprising?
Hi, Joe. This is Cole. What I found surprising when interviewing Mr. Oko and Dr. Weinberg is going back to what Faye said, also how communities and marginalized communities are being discriminated and impacted based on the information that's being collected and technology being used. And we look at some of the colleges aren't being so transparent. So it's harming people of color financially. It's people who are not financially considered. I'm trying to think. Okay, skip that real quick. It's just that people who are considered financially having hardships, and then people in the LGBTQ plus community is what Mr. Oko spoke about as being one of the marginalized communities directly impacted, and seeing that college isn't always transparent about people being able to decline or use the information is just something that I learned from these interviews, and makes me just rethink of that I could actually not have to use some of these platforms that are used by the colleges.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else have anything that surprised them?
Yeah. Hi, Joe. One thing that surprised me, I would say this is more of a positive facet regarding SUNY's private policy and how they treat their student data. This is directly from their website. SUNY does not collect any personal information about you unless you provide that information voluntarily by sending an email, completing the SUNY information request form or completing the online application. So lucky for us students, our social security numbers are not being sold to private data companies. So in that case, if we were to answer a survey or send any kind of demographic information via email to some sort of SUNY organization, then they will be able to take that information. But again, lucky for us students, the information that we give to the schools in order to keep safe is being kept safe.
The next question that we wanted to touch on through our research is, what responsibility do you guys think university leaders, administrators, faculty, and policymakers have when it comes to understanding how student data is used? Should they be expected to educate students about data use and digital literacy? And if so, what might that look like in practice?
To answer that question, Joe, from interviewing the SUNY Oswego's associate provost, Dr. Ramin Mohammadi, I've learned that faculty and staff have the responsibility of keeping non-directory information of students. It's illegal for them to put out that kind of information, while directory information such as their name, insurance, and phone are able to be given to those who may ask of that. While it is not common to do so, or it may not be the most ethical thing to do, anybody who works in the administrative side of the school can look at a student's data, but they should not do so unless they have to. Should they be expected to educate students about data use and digital literacy? I believe so. I think that this could look like a digital literacy class for all kinds of students. It can be optional, like a digital literacy 101 course, a comm course that can be an elective for all kinds of students. I know that comm students, we learn about this stuff because it's kind of like we have to, but I do believe that they should be expected to educate students, or at least offer a course to allow them to learn about how their data is being used and much more.
Those are great points, Nye. And I know, like I said, I'm new to the SUNY Oswego, so I haven't been able to have a conversation with a lot of the faculty there. I do know at the college where I work at that a lot of faculty are really big on trying to get students to understand a lot of what's going on, especially with things like AI and some of these different technologies, and have that conversation continue. So those are all wonderful points. What else does everyone think about the roles of university leadership and faculty, et cetera, to educate students?
I think that when it comes to administration, they have a very serious responsibility, because in some ways they may not even realize the tools that they're linking with school that are, basically mandatory for students to use, whether it's learning management systems like Brightspace in the case of SUNY Oswego, or any other tools that the school links to, getting an education from that school. There is a large responsibility there. And the university administration has the responsibility to educate themselves on what data, they may not be releasing that data, but that data may still be being collected by a learning management system or a company that has, ties to AI systems that is then being used to train that platform. So the school itself may not be totally aware, and I think that it is the responsibility of the university to educate themselves on that. And I think that consent, when it comes to data being collected, goes further than just clicking yes on the terms of service. That isn't enough when we're talking about students and university administration. It isn't just, you come to our school, so you consent to this. That shouldn't be how it is. I think that university, even potentially, when undergraduate students come to SUNY Oswego, they have, at the beginning of their first semester, or when they're transferring in, they're going through orientation, they're going through different trainings, and maybe part of that should be informing students of the ways in which their data is being collected, not just as a class that's being offered, although I do think that offering a class, like Naya said, was a really great idea, that's open not just to communication students. But I think that the administration has a serious responsibility to learn, understand themselves about the ways that student data is being used, collected, and sold, and informing students so that students can properly give informed consent.
Yes, those are wonderful points, Faye. Sarah, I know you were about to jump in.
Yeah, Faye touched on it, and kind of going off of what Naya said as well. It seems like there are a lot of ways that student data is being used and collected that you just never would even think about. For instance, if you're in a video conference for a regular class meeting, that may be something that is being used to train AI. And even if what is being discussed there isn't something that, or the conversations aren't things that are necessarily used and kept by the professor, it still may be something. And this was kind of going to the first question too, something that was just very revelatory for me was the amount of access that these private companies have to use the information and access it and kind of train their own systems off of it in our conversations and our ideas and our thoughts and our appearances. It seems to me that students, especially if you're in a setting where there's compulsory use of these technologies to have a normal student experience, that there should at least be an email sent out to students saying, this is something, it doesn't even, considering what we actually have received as far as terms of what's being used, what's being saved. I don't know that there's a lot of transparency about it, or even an understanding that it's going on. And anything is kind of better than what's going on now, especially in settings where you think that something may be private.
Sure. And I know, too, like I said, when we talked a little bit about terms of service in our Business of Student Data episode, Tyler and I, it was interesting to see with that data and actually trying to locate where on these policies or these service lists where to actually go to find out what happens with your data. Typically, you have to go sometimes into the privacy policy within that terms of use, which is even more links on an already long document. And it actually was easier to Google a lot of times to type in the name of the program and particularly data use to get to sort of those areas. So I found that to be very interesting for sure. But kind of going off of that point where you're talking about these companies and the access to what they have, we'll just transition into our next question, which is what kind of policies or practices should companies adopt when working with student or consumer data, especially in educational settings? And how do we balance innovation with protection? Kind of looking at what does ethical data use look like in our student context?
I think something that kind of... Oh, Tyler, are you going to say something?
Yeah, I think it just looks like consent, like informed consent and the ability to opt out and control or view where your data is kept or used. So if there's an openness around it and you're then willingly being a participant in whatever that system is, I think that's a solid place to at least start.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I also think that it may be appropriate, especially in a system like we're in, where you have to use, like we're in an online class, so we have to meet virtually if we want to meet, or we have to submit our work digitally and things like that. It seems to me that it would be fair to have, when you're in a system like that, where it's just a compulsory part of what you're trying to accomplish, and not something that you're using recreationally, like as social media or if you're video chatting with your friends, it seems appropriate for there to be some type of protection for that data, specifically when you're in an educational setting, because there isn't, it's an institutional use of something. And when that's at play, you can't, even if you don't consent to it, then what are you going to do? Not go to class? It's not really an option if you want to participate in a normal way. So I think that it would be appropriate to have additional settings and institutionally, like an institutionalized technology.
Well, that makes sense. And I know, too, back in our episode interviewing Dr. Crooks, there was some discussion about what steps some citizens are even taking, not always in just the educational space across the country, in the result of some of these things. So definitely something to keep an eye on. What did everyone else think?
I believe that student data should be handled similarly to how our health data is handled. The healthcare system has HIPAA laws placed by the federal government in order to protect everybody's medical record or any information that's put into that record. Similarly to how the SUNY system tackles their data, the healthcare system only uses our data in a way where if we submit a survey with demographics, that's the way it's utilized. School systems should be doing the same. They shouldn't be taking our data that we give them to store safe, such as our addresses, social security numbers, financial information. That information should never be sold to third-party companies, the same way that it isn't in the healthcare system. The only way that the information should ever be able to be accessed, which in this case it shouldn't be, but the only way that this kind of information should be touched by someone is through some sort of hacking situation. And I know that sounds negative, but it in an illegal sense, because legally our information should be wrapped up safe. If somebody who's working on the dark web wants to go in and try and hack information, fine, let them. If they get in, then that's terrible, but it's going to happen regardless. There's nothing we can do to stop that. So overall, the healthcare system is the standard as to how data in all industries should be handled.
I think that when it comes to informed consent regarding student information, I think that a big part of that is that students feel like they have no choice. Because if I don't want to use Brightspace, well, then I can't be in SUNY Oswego because SUNY Oswego as an institution uses Brightspace. And there's no button that I have seen on Brightspace that allows you to say, clear my data. Even if I were to leave the university, which I don't have any intentions to do, there's no way for me to take my information out of Brightspace so that they can't continue to use it for whatever reason, for their different, whether to train AI systems through other companies or whether to just, have data on me, in the big data system. It's often the case that students feel like they don't have a choice. So giving some of that agency back to students, I think, is really important. Whether that's a button that says, like, clear my data, like, you can clear your cookies or clear your cache, something like that will wipe out that system, that information from within the system. Or whether it is genuinely allowing students to make sure that their data isn't being extracted to begin with. And I think that push has to come on an institutional level. And that can be through students requesting that of the institution, of their schools, of the universities, but it has to be a push from the universities to the learning management systems like Brightspace, like Blackboard, like Canvas. Because if an individual student is going to say, Canvas, please, I don't want you to take my data, they're not going to do anything. But if a university or several universities comes out and says, we want a way for our students to be able to revoke permission, to say we don't want you to take our data or to wipe out data that's already in the system, that should be made available. And universities, when coming together, will have a stronger voice. So I think that has to be something that's pushed for on a university institutional level.
So transitioning we were talking about companies, but looking at kind of our final question here, what roles do students have or could they have in shaping the future of data policies in higher education? And how can we move from being passive data subjects to active participants in the conversation?
I think students should, since students have rights, I think they should go and advocate for the right, especially for transparency around data policy and collecting. And this would help, I believe, advocate and show other students what is happening to their data and how it's being collected and can impact them. I believe students starting campaigns or just having, like we spoke about earlier, advocating for classes that would explain the policies of data collecting for students would be something that would be gratefully and very helpful for the students themselves.
I think that another way that students could maybe contribute is through their student government bodies, and students who are aware of these issues maybe going to their student governments and influencing them to, or asking them at least, to see what they may be able to do in encouraging policy changes or just even introducing new courses to their schools so that they can understand. Because I feel like with this type of thing, the first step towards no longer being a passive data subject is just knowing that you're a passive data subject. So even just creating some sort of awareness campaign, in addition to their 6-part series, of course, could be something that students could do.
That's great. And student government bodies are a good way for students to be heard on their campuses, for sure. So definitely getting them involved in the conversation. Faye, you had something?
Yeah, I really like that idea, Sarah. On our campus specifically, we have student association, and many students, I think, I'm not sure about online students, but definitely all students who live on campus or who attend in person are paying a fee, towards the student association being able to run. So if we're going to be paying money into it, if we're going to be involved in our school, we also should be able to have them represent the things that we want them to do. So in our case, that's student association. And they even have a lot of schools, including ours, have open meeting times where people can stop in and express a concern or just talk about what's important to them. And although with us, because we're online, that may be more difficult. But for people who can, that can be something you can do, even to stop in to express interest and find out if there are other people who care about the issue as much as you do.
No, that makes a lot of sense too. And I mean, even think beyond just organizations too. I mean, if there are those of us that are in certain courses that are learning these things, I think just having a conversation with your friends and family members is always, it's a simple thing one can do that will kind of allow the word to spread and maybe for change to at least happen. Because the first step is, of course, making one aware of some of these issues before they can act to create positive change for it. So we're out of time, but always remember that data may define systems, but students define the future. Thanks for joining us on this journey through DataU.